Thank you, Brad. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Max Agel to our colloquium. Max is a postdoctoral fellow at the Rural Sociology Group at Wageningen University and an associated researcher at the Tunisian Observatory for Food Sovereignty and the Environment. He has a PhD in development sociology from Cornell University, and he specializes in the agrarian question, rural political economy, Tunisian national liberation movement, and post-colonial development in the Arab world. His articles have been published in the Journal of Peasant Studies, Review of African Political Economy, and the Journal Globalizations. He's also an associate editor at Agrarian South. And this year, Dr. Agel published his book, A People's Green New Deal, with Pluto Press in 2021. And this book is amazing. It gives us so much food for thought. It's so well-researched and so engagingly written. So I'm really looking forward to this talk. Max is joining us today from Tunisia, and we're thrilled to have you. Welcome. We wish we could welcome you in person. You will have about 40 minutes for your talk, and then we'll have time for discussion. So thank you for being here, Max, and please take it away.
Wonderful. So thank you so much to Vladimir for the considerate invitation to share some of my work and research on this book. And thank you to the Center and the University and the Colloquium and all organizers for the invitation and for your work. I really appreciate it. And I'm happy to be able to share it with a lot of people whose work I respect. And looks like a lot of people additionally whose work I respect have joined the call. So I'm really looking forward to this. What am I going to discuss? I'm going to discuss the kind of social, intellectual, political milieu out of which this whole discussion of a Green New Deal emerged in the first place. And then I'm going to discuss how I conceptualize the various options for dealing with the climate crisis writ large, but especially the types of proposals that are coming out from the United States. And then finally, I'm going to elaborate on the content of my book. And I, of course, don't want to call it my own proposal because, of course, it's symbiotic, hopefully not parasitic, on really a huge variety of work that other people have done that I basically synthesized and put into a package that hopefully is engaging and appealing to people who do not accept that the world we live in is acceptable. So to begin, why are we discussing a Green New Deal? Now, this kind of, there's an obvious answer, right? The obvious answer is because, yeah, Ocasio-Cortez proposed we're going to discuss a Green New Deal, and so we're discussing, right? But for those of us, who, especially, although I'm totally untrained, but ended up being an intellectual historian, this is not really how we discuss ideas, and this is not how policy proposals, which gather a wide attention or even a small attention, emerge, right? I mean, there is, it's much more productive, I think, both to take a sociology of knowledge approach, but also just to situate the emergence of this very kind of enveloping discussion that really has permeated, for a time, certainly permeated the intellectual atmosphere, and to say, okay, why exactly were we discussing it in the first place? And why were we discussing it in the specific ways in which it's being discussed? And so I think also it's very much naturalized also. People are like, okay, this climate crisis is horrendous. There's a response. Well, of course there's a response. And I really actually would like to throw a small monkey wrench in that very understandable, but I think probably not entirely justifiable reaction, in the sense that the climate crisis is not new at all, right? And those of us who have been following science outside of Fox News know very well that it's been apparent that to all concerned, that, and probably also to those not concerned, that the climate crisis has actually been very well substantiated scientifically in terms of the probabilistic terms of the natural sciences, it's been substantiated more than most findings or almost any other findings in the natural sciences, right? It's very clear that this crisis has been occurring. It's been very clear for at least 30 years that this crisis has been occurring, right? So why are we discussing it at all? I think there's a few things that are the background that shape why this proposal for a Green New Deal emerged into public view in the way that it did, right? And I think they are, there's ecological issues and there's also political and social issues, right? And so, I prefer to trace this to, at least in part, to 2008 in terms of shifts in the domestic structure of thought, where the global financial crisis at that point started giving very slowly, and it's kind of boggling that we're now 13 years after it. At that point, there were suddenly articles on like the front page of, I think, Foreign Policy magazine by Leo Panich, if I remember correctly, being like, is this the return of Marx, right? And I think that was useful as an index of the rising delegitimization of, be it neoliberalism or be it capitalism, as a mode of hegemonic rule, right? It lost a great deal of its legitimacy amongst wide layers of the domestic core population. And I say core, I'm going to get to why I'm using that specific word in a little bit. I think this is one very important factor. And that kind of break and rupture has created space within which it becomes very much more reasonable, not only to think, but for many people to think about the world differently, right? And so that actually shouldn't be naturalized. That actually is a social phenomenon that was produced, right? That's part of it. And that in turn is very much linked to a widespread social breakdown, I think, in the United States, to which Ocasio-Cortez responded. And I think there's two other phenomena before I get a bit more specifically into why the Ocasio-Cortez proposal emerged the way it did. One of them is, of course, the rise of China in the world system, which is, whatever one thinks of that rise, it's clearly a rise that is displacing the United States as a kind of solitary or unitary power within the world system, right? And that's especially also what's on the table is also one, the fact that China is engaging in the world trading system in such a way that more value is flowing to it, right? This is just what's happening empirically. The other aspect of it is that China is actually engaged in a lot more production of renewables than the United States is, the percentage of its energy stock. It's producing a great deal of renewables, and it's actually slowly getting out ahead of the United States in a certain sense, in terms of its ability to ramp up this type of production. And of course, this is to say there also is a crisis of the Earth system itself, right? And this is also starting to make its impact felt, especially in the United States and Europe, right? I mean, and I don't want to say either that this is 100% novel. I mean, we all remember, I think, that heat wave, for example, in France that killed many, many, many thousands of people. So it's not novel that climate should be impacting the global north, but it's novel that it's impacting it with such regularity and such people, I think, certainly I among them, we can visibly experience and viscerally experience these shifts in the climate system. And so this makes the attendant kind of scientific verification of that even more acute, right? In the sense that it makes us see physically, in a sense, or with our eyes or with our senses, what the science is telling us. And so it becomes more present. And I think this is very widespread amongst great portions of the population. So upon this tableau, this social and ecological and political tableau, this is what Ocasio-Cortez emerged upon, right? And what is she representing? One, she's representing some kind of redistributive solution to the crises occurring in the United States on the political and social fronts, right? There's a proposal she incarnates in this way a proposal to actually deal with certain aspects of most pressing social inequalities, to deal with the fact that the infrastructure is totally falling apart, and also to deal with the fact that the climate issue should in fact be dealt with, and also that the climate issue could be dealt with in such a way that it actually melds social and ecological issues together into this kind of proposal for a new, literally a new Green Deal, but one that is in essence a form of green Keynesian pump priming, and that will lead to massive growth in probably the US industrial plan, and will actually, in some measure, if something like that were going to be implemented, and some warped version of it may well be implemented under Biden, this will conduce to some kind of reindustrialization, I think, of the United States. So this is the background, which I think is important to keep in mind, right? This is not coming from nowhere, and it's one amongst many proposals, or one amongst many ways of managing the US productive system, the social system, the political economy, the class system that is vying for superiority in the current moment. I mean, we can also think of, it's very clear, of course, that Trump is was a different type of response. And that type of response is also far from being exhausted, right? And then there's other responses like Biden. These are responses, and these are ways of political management of a system of flows and of accumulation that pre-exist any specific set of policies that are meant to remold them. So this takes us to Ocasio, the substance of her proposal, which in a sense has become less important, I think, than if I were talking about this a year and a half ago. I would have talked about it probably differently. But I think it's become, its substance is in a sense less important. So I see her proposal as actually one of 4 possible proposals that I think at least useful to slot a lot of proposals and thinking about the Green New Deal into this set of 4 types of possible resolutions. Now, very quickly, and then I'll elaborate a bit more on the first 3, and then we'll talk about the good one, because it's always good to talk about good things that give us some optimism that the situation can somehow at least be dealt with in a humane way. Those 4 options are, I think, a far-right proposal for elite transition, a kind of liberal proposal involving some measure of redistribution and industrialization, a left liberal proposal that is looking at a large amount of domestic redistribution with some attention to international issues, and the slot into which I slot People's Green New Deal, which is what I think is a substantively internationalist proposal for or a set of ideas for changing the world and making it better. So let me start with, very briefly, with the elite transition. Now, this is, very often when we talk about kind of what elite or ruling class political engineering are the actual proposals that are on the table to change the world, this kind of invites a kind of conspiratorial thinking. And so, anyone should check it out. This is extremely well empirically established what exactly is being considered, right? And it's done by institutions like the World Economic Forum, like Climate Finance Leadership Initiative, Stortolin Foundation, and so forth. A set of institutions, the Breakthrough Institute in the US, there's also an Australian Breakthrough Institute, which is very closely tied to national security sectors, to industrial sectors. Now, and the Climate Finance Leadership Initiative is tied to the UN, but also tied to Bloomberg, Goldman Sachs. So what is this set or the ensemble of policies that these people are proposing? In essence, one, there is a plan to financialize nature. In other words, turn nature into a new frontier of accumulation by turning basically the production of say ecosystem services, turning that into a new revenue stream. Also turning the green energy transition into a revenue stream by extending or crowding capital into the South while also de-risking it, using what the economist Daniela Gabor calls the de-risking state, which actually means investment treaties that effectively hollow out the sovereignty of southern states and make them beholden to whoever's put that money in place. And of course, this is also extremely well documented. Daniela Gabor is doing the absolute best work on this. It's a very central component of what is being planned going forward. And what else? There's a very aggressive role for the national security sector. Some of the proposals from Australia, again, from very mainstream institutions and individuals, call for a decided role for the military in affecting the green transition. Some of this you can see in plans from Elizabeth Warren for the greening of the US military, as well as plans from the Pentagon itself for attending to the climate readiness of the military. And there is emphasis on demographic engineering through the Gates Foundation programs for birth control in Africa, for example. There are a lot of proposals for the replacement of current hydrocarbon use by biofuel use. In other words, supposedly carbon neutral fuels. Where is that going to come from? There are other proposals that are calling both for half Earth, for example, from E.O. Wilson, Harvard biologist, and also proposals calling that likewise say that the land for some of these biofuels can purportedly, it doesn't have an ecological substantiation, could come from pasture, right? So this is kind of the set of plans that are coming from, that I call an elite transition, that substantively keeps the structures of the world economic system intact, but kind of remolds them for a green age. Option two is something like what Ocasio-Cortez has put forward. And I think it's been kind of misleadingly, her plan has actually been misleadingly labeled as democratic socialist or eco-socialist. I think it's more productive to have actually examined what a lot of the plan said. So this is basically a call for immediate and fast renewables transition, possibly by 2030, although the way things are going, increasingly unfeasible. This is a plan for clear anti-racist initiatives with some attention to the settler colonial contradiction in the United States. But it's also a call for funneling, doing a lot of state corporate community partnerships. And of course, this understandably sounds extremely alluring, but what Bridget O'Loughlin, as a sociologist of Africa, has pointed out is that community is actually, and also words like frontline communities, these are actually concepts that are shorn of a class content, right? It's not clear who is to benefit from something called a community, an aid for community development, for example, or a partnership between a community and a corporation. That's another aspect. There's also, I think it's notable what these proposals are silent about. These proposals are essentially silent on the South, that is the majority of humanity, except for when they put forward ideas concerning the US to become a green tech leader, right? So this is, I think, very reminiscent of the workshop of the world model that dominated post-World War II. What's also silent is any call for actual confrontation with the oil companies. In fact, in some ways, this is actually a more conservative position than you would find in the first quadrant. And you can keep that in mind. And finally, so climate debt is not on the agenda, which means large capital grants to the South. So that's quadrant two. Quadrant three is, I think, the most capacious, blurry, and really potentially confusing, because it's really unfolding a huge variety of plans. And so what I think distinguishes these plans from what I'll put forward as the fourth kind of set of proposals is not what's in them, but what is not in them. And I'll just lead off with that, in that these plans, which include the relatively radical, actually, Bernie Sanders plan, all of these plans, which I'm about to discuss, are essentially silent on climate debt. Again, which is, I will elaborate upon when I get to the global Green New Deal. What they share is an orientation to extremely strong domestic redistribution, rising to, in some of the literature, for a call for a socialist transition in the United States by 2040 after last stimulus. That's some of the work. Other of the work is calling in a fervent and polemical, but I think ultimately unprogrammatic and opaque way for decolonization or attention to settler colonialism in the United States. They call for a reduction in the energy use of the top 10 or 20%, whether that's global or internet or domestic. It's never entirely clear. Often calls for there's a lot of attention to the abolitionist movement, for example, in the United States. And probably less fortunately, there is quite a lot of attention to what I think we can best identify as eco-modernism. That is, there tends to be an assumption about technological neutrality. That is, that we should be willing to consider things, including biofuels, including lab meat, including possibly upgrading the quantity of nuclear currently in use and so forth. So there's an assumption that all these technologies are neutral. And so finally, before I get to the last set of proposals, I mean, the other thing that these proposals are particularly strong about, and it's important to give them the credit where the credit is due, is that they're very strong about social reproduction issues within the imperial core. That is, decommodification of large portions of the kind of reproductive labor in the United States, which obviously disproportionately falls upon, or overwhelmingly rather falls upon women, especially along racial lines. A huge investments in public infrastructure, especially clean infrastructure, whether that's retrofit in buildings or perhaps more importantly, creating more parks, which have a cooling effect in putting in place large amounts of public transit, putting in place much more bicycle infrastructure, the types of things that increase the quantity of, we can say, decommodified values or use values available to people without having to pass through the cash nexus. And in fact, of course, substantively make people's lives better in the North. And of course, this is understandably why these calls have a huge amount of appeal. So what are these calls generally silent or muted about? As I said, they're generally silent about climate debt. The best I saw was Bernie Sanders, which called for $200 billion, which sounds like a lot, but it is actually not, if he had won, to go through until 2030, for one example. They tend to not have clarity about what I call the national question or national sovereignty in the South. And I think they are lacking in terms of a conceptualization of the world system. That is, what is the world that we want to change? And, you know, it sounds almost crudely obvious, right? Of course, we have a conception of the world, a conceptualization of the world we have to change, especially if we are offering a critical account of global capitalism. Of course, we have a conceptualization of the world we have to change. But actually, you know, just as highly trained doctors can disagree on the diagnosis of a person's ailments, people who are even sharing certain kind of normative political values and also have some training about how to understand the world can very much disagree about the nature of the world's social and their accordingly ecological pathologies, and therefore what needs to be done to stop them. So this, to fix them. So this brings us to the fourth proposal, into which I slot a People's Green New Deal. I absolutely don't want to say that this is a Green New Deal encompasses this fourth quadrant, because it's quite not, right? I developed, I think it's worthwhile situating the work before I put it forward. I mean, this is a work that I developed really in a conversation with a lot of critical work on ecology and development, primarily, but not only from the South. I mean, the most important touchstone, anyone would read the book would see, is the Cochabamba People's Agreement. And whenever I talk about the book, I'm happy if you buy the book, but or just read it online for free. But please read the Cochabamba People's Agreement, because this is an absolutely fundamental document for understanding the state of the art of Southern climate thinking and the demands that came from the South at a certain historical moment to try and move everybody to a shared horizon of developmental convergence and justice and decolonization, right? So please check out that text. It is something that repays one, if not several readings. And of course, there's a great deal of engagement with Southern, Latin American, Arab, African, Indian economists and development planners, especially because reflecting my work here in Tunisia and also in the Arab region on the whole. And also, of course, a strong engagement with all sorts of thinkers working on appropriate technology and agriculture. So what are the pillars of this kind of structural transformation? So in the way that I structured the book, these pillars fall under kind of three very rough categories, right? One of them is agriculture. A second, agriculture encompassing also local, national, United States, and also worldwide land use plan. The second is about infrastructure and industrialization and energy. And the third are a kind of disparate set of questions that I group very loosely around the national question. So let me start by talking a little bit about agriculture. So what is the domestic and world agricultural situation, right? We have an agriculture that, contrary to what some may think, is actually bogglingly overproductive, right? It's producing around 6,000 calories per person, when what's needed is around 3,000 calories per person. Huge portions of it are lost to a variety of sources of waste, including ethanol, some of it including feeding things like corn and other human consumable feed crops to animals, although this does not strike me as one of the key central sources of waste, although it actually should be more or less eliminated. It just shouldn't be overstated in terms of its magnitude. And losses in the supply chain because of the length of supply chains, and also the problems of standardization and monopoly control over supply chains. So we actually have a food system that produces too many calories. Not only that, but it also produces other pathologies. What else does it produce? One of the main pathologies our food and agricultural system produces is poverty. That poverty is particularly acute in the third world, where rural poverty is much more acute than urban poverty. That's a major issue, right? What other kind of waste and wreckage does the current agricultural system produce? It produces a great deal of malnutrition. Despite the amount of calories that are produced, they're eventually processed into a form that is actually extremely deleterious for human beings. What else? Most relevantly for our conversation, the food and agricultural system produces a huge amount of greenhouse gas emissions. The estimates are around 24% of human-produced greenhouse gases come from the agricultural sector. Of course, these are subject to all sorts of debates over the calculation, but let us say that a very large portion of that. What do I think can be proposed in its stead, not only for the United States, but also internationally? I think agriculture is a keystone sector for world developmental convergence. By world developmental convergence, I mean that I think all countries of the world and people within countries should have something like equal access to wealth and the good life, more or less. So how to achieve it? Well, agriculture is obviously totally central in the South in terms of agrarian reforms to break up large semi-feudal agricultural systems and redirect them from export-oriented agriculture, including the export-oriented agriculture of tropical goods that flows to the north and actually fills our supermarkets. That's one part of it. But I think agrarian reform is actually extremely central in the north as well. So we have a system where, in essence, technology has replaced labor, and part of the technological replacement of labor has meant that there's been a loss of capacity to actually husband or steward the land, right? And that has meant that it's instead of attention-intensive agriculture, which I view as distinct from labor-intensive agriculture, you have a capital-intensive and standardized agriculture, which causes huge damages: soil erosion, nitrogen runoff. You have the algal blooms in the Gulf of Mexico, hypoxia, dead zones, leaching into water tables, massive amounts of food-caused probabilistic risks of cancer that we don't even really know about. All kinds of sicknesses, cancer risks from pesticide use, and of course the greenhouse gases themselves. So what do we want to do? We want to shift the agriculture north and south away from an extremely industrial model towards, to the extent possible, an agroecological model, meaning focusing on forms of advanced agriculture that more closely mimic the ecological logic of what are called somewhat misleadingly, traditional agricultural systems. That is, they're more or less closed systems. They involve a great deal of nutrient recycling. They involve a great deal of biodiversity. They require a great deal of attention. They rely on polycultures rather than monocultures. Within the polycultures, there are a diversity of various subspecies or cultivars, varietals of different crops. So 50 varieties of maize, corn in a single plot is very much possible. Now, the benefits of this form of agriculture. Maybe some of you have seen this talk about natural systems agriculture and natural climate solutions and so forth. Based on the rough calculations and that I was able to accumulate in the book, and there's much more work to be done on this front, it seems to me that one, it's very much possible to take that 24% that is the agricultural percentage of carbon emissions and get it to zero. That by itself should actually be astounding to anyone interested in the future of our world, right? You can get that to zero, and you can do so while making all rural people's lives, both in the South and also the North, far better, right? Because you actually part of the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture also involves reducing the chemical inputs that go into agriculture and make it carbon emitting, right? And also producing much more locally, therefore short loops instead of long loops, which means that all the carbon emissions that go with transportation are thenceforth eliminated. Because this type of knowledge-intensive, relatively metabolically closed agricultural systems are attention-intensive, you need to, which you also need to, on social justice terms alone, carry out large-scale agrarian reforms. Now, this is the minimum, but the floor in a sense in terms of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. But there's also the ceiling. What is the ceiling? The ceiling is that at the very least, it's been calculated, for example, that using things like buffer crops, using things like strips of trees next to cereal crops, using all the forms of buffers next to rivers, using forms of cover crop technology, that is making sure that soil is covered year round instead of being exposed to the elements. Through these things, you can absorb possibly something like 10% of current US greenhouse gas emissions on the whole. That is in addition to getting greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture to zero. It seems to me that kindred calculations worldwide would probably come up with something similar. So we have something, let us say, that the range of reasonable estimates is between 8 and 35% of annual greenhouse gas emissions could actually be absorbed by carbon negative agricultural system, right? This is actually a miracle, right? We actually have a low technology, that is distributed technology that could be implemented by people, common people all over the world, that could actually go a long way towards solving our current climate crisis, right? Why isn't it being implemented? Because it actually, there's very little benefit in it for the powers that be in the world system. So that's the agricultural pillar of that is called the Great Transformation from below. What is the second pillar? The second pillar is reconfiguring energy, industrial, transport, and infrastructural systems. So one, that means as fast as possible conversion to renewable energy systems alongside shrinkage in northern energy use, not only by making northern energy more efficient, but actually making societies more energy conscious and making northern societies able to run on less energy. Now, this is neither to endorse nor debunk the very common and probably the idea of degrowth that I think is probably familiar to a lot of people, right? It's just another way of framing the question that for me is more productive. So the idea is that because we're going to require a huge amount of use of dirty energy in order to produce the clean energy, it makes it ever more imperative to enable our societies to run on less energy if indeed we want to get to 2050 with some kind of modern social world with social justice achievable for most of the human population. That's one aspect of it. And so, of course, the technologies are relatively well known. What is another aspect? Another aspect is comprehensive shifts to democratically managed, but also and publicly owned forms of mass transportation, as well as making cities and suburban and urban areas probably much more livable, right? So this means, first of all, shifting, of course, to bicycles, shifting to many more buses, shifting to many more trains, shifting to national trains, possibly doing a lot of forward-looking investment in different forms of flight that could replace airplanes, which there's no way to run at the current moment without fossil fuels, even though there's some experiments with electric airplanes. They haven't really advanced very far for obvious reasons. This is something else. So this type of transformation in the infrastructural and transport system is absolutely necessary for any sort of just transition in the United States. And of course, the whole world deserves analogs of this type of public transportation system. Another is the retooling of industries. So we need to actually be against the kind of planned obsolescence, which actually which is a feature, not a bug, of monopoly control of the industrial fabric. And because they produce things with using super exploiting Southern labor, and the result is that Americans, in particular, Northern Europeans, buy a lot of things that have an extremely high carbon load, right? And instead, if we have right to repair and movements, and we have our legislation, and we have bans on planned obsolescence, then, of course, accordingly, one, we would cut into the profits of the large monopolies, of course, hopefully in the longer run or medium run, eliminating them. And second of all, we would, of course, sharply reduce the ecological load or burden of our current industrial fabric. So this is absolutely critical. Another aspect, I think, which is underappreciated and often invites rather uninvited accusations of Luddism, even though the Luddites were brilliant, is that we need to actually manage to try and think about consciously about why do we build in the way that we build, and what are the actual material inputs we use for our building. That is, why is it that we have come to assume that concrete, glass, metal, and all sorts of artificial fibers, these are the basis of textiles, a large portion of textiles. These are also the basis of large portions of our urban and suburban infrastructures. Whereas if we built with natural materials comprehensively on a worldwide, and especially given where I'm speaking right now, a national basis, you can actually make building either carbon neutral or ultimately carbon negative, right? Because you plant a tree, use the wood, you harvest it, and another tree can grow in its place. This is simplifying the case, because old growth trees store far more carbon dioxide than new growth trees. But nevertheless, the point is actually, I think, taking a political ecology approach, that is politicizing with an eye to the long run sustenance and well-being of the ecology, the actual material inputs of the things we use. And I don't want to say the things we buy, because I'm actually in favor of the widespread decommodification of social life in the United States and on a worldwide basis. This also means that, of course, a lot of sectors will have to slowly shrink and be eliminated. For example, a lot of the chemical sectors, a lot of the fossil fuel sectors, a lot of the, for example, automobile manufacturing. That not only means just transitions for all those sectors, which is absolutely critical, north and south, so that people actually have political buy-in into this kind of great transformation from below. That's part of it. But the other part of it is, I think, building on the extant demands for decommodified social rights, for example, that really have gained correct popularity in the United States and Northern Europe, or Europe on the whole, over the last 10 years, and actually folding them in to this proposal for these ideas for a people's transformation. Right? So that means, of course, decommodified access to healthcare, but also thinking about that healthcare ecologically, right? Not thinking of healthcare as something we just get. No, healthcare can either, as it currently exists, be 8% of US emissions, which is the case because it's reactive and technologically intensive, or it could try and ape the Kerala or Cuban model, which is actually preventative, community-based, and based on widespread investment in I don't know what to call it other than human capital, or just training doctors and nurses on a very high per capita base of the population. You have carbon non-intensive, human skills intensive medical care, right? So this is another alternative. Now, these are just illustrative, but in fact, in the book I have some dozens, but in fact, if one researches the topic, one finds probably thousands and thousands of real planning proposals for decarbonizing and improving the qualitative quality and values of a myriad of probably every single sector in the United States and also abroad. So I think this is absolutely critical. To wrap up, what is the third pillar? The third pillar is actually the pillar where I think that this fourth quadrant has the sharpest divergence from the dominant proposals that emerge from the social democratic left, let us say. Now, what is the third component? The third component rests on a conceptualization of the US as an empire, which should be obvious, right? But if you actually want to implement a global People's Green New Deal, you have to say, okay, what are the things that actually prevent people in the North from living in comity with the people in the South? And this, of course, is one, the systems of uneven exchange, that is uneven access to labor resources on a North-South basis. This is very well substantiated in a very wide range of academic literature. And this also means dealing with the fact that there are obstacles to the realization of the good life in the South, and those obstacles come from the North. So concretely, what are the several pillars in turn that deal with this national question? The first, of course, is decolonization. Decolonization meaning supporting national liberation movements, first of all, in places like the United States and Canada, which are settler colonies. And also, of course, settler colonies as in Palestine, where there's a struggle for national liberation. And you can't achieve any kind of ecological just society unless you have national control over productive forces, but national political control over your own fate. Otherwise, there's no building for a sustainable society. To arrive at a sustainable society, you face a political obstacle that's in front of you. And that has to be recognized as part of a great transformation that can enfold everybody, because people have distinct political obstacles and have been inserted in distinct ways into the world political system, right? So this supporting this call for the other aspect of this call for self-determination and support for national level, at least as a floor, not as a ceiling, national self-determination and ability to determine the political, social, and ecological structure of domestic social formations, is that there has to be a real respect for national sovereignty in the South. This doesn't mean national sovereignty to allow, and because no, we're not in a position to allow or not allow any form of denial of social or democratic rights in third world countries. No, it means understanding that they have to be, other states have to be able to determine their own fate, right? And there's many ways that the US is not currently allowing that, for example, through unilateral coercive measures, which currently are being applied to a wide range of countries in the third world, right? And this actually disallows them from determining in a free way the texture, their internal ecological and social texture. This also means demilitarization, right? This is absolutely central. Demilitarization, because if the US military were a country, this would be between around ranked 47th in terms of total greenhouse gas emissions. So absolutely, there is no worldwide just transition without the demilitarization of the United States and also the rest of the European core. 4, and this is actually the most essential. So I hope not too many people have left before hearing this part, but there is a call for climate debt, which came from the People's Agreement of Cochabamba, was submitted to a variety of UN proceedings, has not been established, of course, as normative or as law of the land in terms of the climate convenings, but continues to be a live demand coming from the South. This is the demand for climate debt. Climate debt is based on the understanding that not only did nations of the South deserve the political decolonization or liberation, and I think that is very widely agreed, and they deserved but probably did not achieve economic decolonization and national liberation, but also the atmosphere likewise should be decolonized. But how was it colonized? It was colonized in the sense that there is a certain amount of space in the atmosphere for the waste of carbon dioxide. Now, who took that space for this waste? primarily, but not solely, what is now called the North, right, over the course of industrialization. Over the course of industrialization, extremely cheap and energy-dense coal and oil were burnt to allow the US, Europe, Japan, more recently South Korea, in a much more complicated way, Soviet Union, then the Russia, burnt up a huge amount of very energetically intense materials and were able to build up massive industrial plants, right? Which actually became the basis for a lot of what, for a period at least, came to be called prosperity. So that was not consented to. And if we think of, say, the earth as belonging in, depending, of course, on the cosmology one adheres to, but it's very loosely saying belonging to the people who live on it, then there was no actual agreement from the world's population to allow this enclosure, right? So this actually produces the right for Southern nations, those who did not emit nearly as much greenhouse gas emissions, to have a claim to climate debt. Climate debt is it is a monetary analog for the decolonization of the atmosphere, because those gases cannot currently be removed, saying that they have a right to restitution for all of the CO2 that they weren't allowed to burn. That's part of it. Another part is the mitigation debt, that is payment for the suffering that they have suffered from. A beautiful book about this is A Climate of Injustice, that really surveys the North-South dimensions, the annual climate damage that's been hitting the South. I mean, I think probably a lot of people may remember what happened in Mozambique with the cyclone, but it's actually constant in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, and large portions of Africa. There are constant inundations, floods, droughts. These are actually clearly linked to climate debt. So these are actually assaults on the productive systems of the South. These make arise a debt that ought to be repaid. And then finally, there's an adaptation debt, that is, these countries need help to produce the appropriate technologies to adapt to the climate change that is now baked into the system. What is the total? What was demanded at the Cochabamba People's Agreement 10 years ago was $1.2 trillion a year, roughly, from the US, $3.2 trillion from the Annex I countries, that is the OECD plus what are called the transition or former Soviet bloc countries. So these numbers were around 6% of GNP a year for an unstated political horizon. Now, what was the political brilliance of the call that came from Cochabamba? They stated that if the US can currently spend $1 trillion on its military a year, that is ending life, why can't it spend, on the other hand, those precise $1 trillion enabling life, right? So that is the live demand that comes from the South, and that is the demand that is unfortunately not really being present or emphasized in a lot of fantastic proposals for Northern ecological and social redistribution. And I think it is actually the axis or the keystone of People's Green New Deal that actually can make the world big enough for everybody. So I'm sorry for going a bit over, and I look forward to your questions, concerns, comments, critiques, and condemnations if necessary. Thank you.
Max, thank you so much for this incredible, stimulating talk. Okay, now let's proceed to the discussion. Yes, please join me in, thanking Max. If you have any questions, please raise your hand or through Zoom or write stack in the chat, and then I will call on you. And if Max does not mind, perhaps we will bundle questions, right, as they arise.
No more than two, because honestly, I get discombobulated. So
excellent.
Sorry.
So, do I see any raised hands? I can actually start. I can throw out the first question. So in your book, you provide this great outline of different Green New Deals offered until now, from eco-nationalist to eco-modernist to eco-socialist. And you make an argument that the roots of many ideas inherent in the Green New Deal, especially the more socialist and egalitarian versions, are in the global South in the age of decolonization. So could you expand a bit more on them and guide us through the thinkers from the global South whom we need to know and acknowledge and celebrate for their revolutionary ideas? And let's also take a question from Marcus Schultz.
Thank you so much, Max. This is just wonderful. I'm so sympathetic to your ideas and vision. I mean, we could go ahead with implementing it all. But before that, maybe a worrisome question that bothers me since a long time when I look about the powers that are, among which one of the key issues is how to overcome the sunken investments and the vested interests of certain well-established industries that seem at times to actually go along with a rhetoric that agrees to climate sustainability and even global social equity, but then in practice, they are carving out exceptions at a local level here and there and there and there, so that it becomes like a Swiss cheese with only holes. And that then undermines the changes. So we get a lot of more agreement already on the level of rhetoric than on the level of putting things in an actual practice. Sometimes it's even in collusion with unions who fear for the jobs that are and fear for being left out of restructuration funds. For example, Joe mentioned the senator of West Virginia right now holds up more ambitious legislation as he is associated with coal. Similarly, we can look at the role of Poland with a brown coal interest in the EU. So we have here and there powerful players. Sometimes they pay lip service, so they don't necessarily, share the extreme right's denialism, but they pay the lip service and then they undermine it and say, just not our industry, just not our region. Here, let's go a bit slower, and that undermines it.
Great. So thank you for these questions. Marcus, in advance, I'm not going to have a very good answer to your question. Otherwise, I would be doing something else. Maybe I'd be implementing it. But I will try anyway. Badly, in fact. Okay, so I'm gonna start with Vladimir's question. So thank you, and I neglected this question to some extent of these thinkers of the global South who are guiding us, and I appreciate you pushing on it. So there are a lot, and there's a bias, of course. My bias is, reflected in the intellectual history work I'm doing, and of course, who's guided it. But the thinkers, I think, are so central for helping us think about two things. One, the polarized nature of our world, right? And this is something we aren't always accustomed to thinking about, that the polarization within the world system, that is the polarization not within nations, but between them, which is very, very well established empirically. This is not an accident of the world system. This is an actual structural mechanism, which is because if, and it could seem obvious, if some people are going to be wealthy, that wealth has to come from somewhere, which means exploiting other people, right? It might seem a little absurd when I put it in such stark terms, right? So, but that is the case, right? So where did that wealth come from? And who taught us how that wealth came from, where it came from? The people who taught us are the people who came from those countries that saw the most wealth extracted, right? So really foundational for me have been, one, the Indian thinkers, Utsa and Prabhat Patnaik, who have done just the best work on the income deflation in South Asia, especially India, both during colonialism and also during the neoliberal period. That is, income deflation, which means people have smaller incomes, and it means they actually have not enough access to food and are starving to death. And that is because land is being diverted to other uses, primarily in the north. The diversion, in turn, of that land also means producing products whose supply prices have to remain low so that they can be cheap inputs for northern consumers and northern producers, right? Which is also creates part of the problem. This is why we have problematic climate movements in the north, because we have trouble seeing it because we are not there, right? That's okay. Part of the self-criticism is understanding that. So Utsa, Prabhat, and Naik, absolutely essential. For Africa, especially North Africa, first of all, Samir Amin, who's done just miraculous work on the underdevelopment and the reproduction of underdevelopment in the world system. Also building, of course, on the work of Raul Prabesh and others from CEPAL, but taking it, I think, in a more radical direction. He's kind of an uncredited, in some spheres, founder actually of dependency theory. That Africa, the Arab region, had its own founder of dependency theory as well. And then the way his work in turn was taken up in the Arab region, and a couple of thinkers that I find absolutely remarkable. And I wouldn't be surprised if I have some Arabophone, definitely have Francophone listeners here or attendees at this presentation, should check out the work of Ismail Sabri Abdallah, whose works are easily available in Arabic and should be available from anyone's library, and Salahuddin Lamani, who was really working on this question in terms of sustainable agricultural development in Tunisia. Is actually doing a project on him now. Absolutely brilliant. If you can just read a few of his stuff, a few things are available as PDF. This guy was actually planning a sustainable ecological civilization for Tunisia. These guys, so this stuff is absolutely remarkable. From the Latin American sphere, who I find remarkable also, the work of Yvette Perfecto, although she's currently residing in the north, but that is her origin, working along with John Vandermeer, thinking about how we can have, we can meld together biodiversity conservation, food sovereignty, agroecology, permanently sustainable farming systems, and social justice through involving agrarian reform, and their work in Nature's Matrix. I mean, it's just been absolutely formative. So these are just a few of the thinkers. I mean, there's a lot there, maybe too many. So those are some suggestions. In terms of what to do in sunken investments. Now, this actually is going to conveniently allows me to return to something that I just touched upon. And this is that the powers that be, AKA the ruling class, are prepared, I think, within a certain, you guys can hear me, right? Okay, because his screen was frozen. Okay. The audio is okay, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, no, because there was like a frozen screen on my iPhone. I wasn't sure. All right, so I think the ruling class is prepared to surrender a lot of these stranded assets. And you can see grains of it, for example, it's in portions of it are, for example, in this document by the Climate Finance Leadership Initiative, which includes like Bloomberg, Goldman Sachs. I mean, these are the rulers of the universe, right? They are saying, okay, it is not clear that public opinion will allow the payments if the large oil and coal companies are expropriated. In fact, the oil and coal companies are rolling over ever larger portions of their public investments into renewables, right? This is happening at an increasing rate, right? So they just actually divert their capital budget into renewables and in a sense expropriate themselves, right? It's underappreciated that the people who would suffer the most from a very fast phase out at a mandatory level of fossil fuels is not Exxon, right? Exxon in our current setup will get money or roll over its investment portfolio. What will happen to Trinidad and Tobago? And what will happen to Iraq? And what will happen to Venezuela? And what will happen to Algeria? and what will happen to Bolivia, right? These are countries that are extremely resource dependent for a huge portion of their foreign currency, and even the currency they use to supply food. And if any form of, and this is why we really need to pay attention, I think, to the North-South distinction when we think about proposals that on their face are absolutely alluring, like get rid of the fossil fuels. Yes, get rid of the fossil fuels. But we have to pay attention to the fact that different people will be affected in different ways. And we can't say that's not an addition, and that's not a modification, and that's not an annex. That has to be right there central with our understanding of the call. You know, phase out fossil fuels with respect to different, with respect to ensuring just transition for everybody. And this is my segue into actually answering, as opposed to wandering around to different things that I wanted to answer on the way to answering the question. How are we dealing? And I think we shouldn't conflate, for example, the someone like the senators who are blocking coal, or people in the Polish government, right? They're conflating the interests of coal and oil producers with the interests of working people who need jobs, and no, we don't want any working people to suffer. We don't want any working people to suffer in the transition, right? This is not our plan. It shouldn't be our plan, in my opinion, to have people who are already not in great shape suffering, because I want them on board with putting in place a good proposal for humanity. So this is why the rhetoric of just transition comes into play, right? And again, this is a rhetoric one has to be very careful with, because the Climate Finance Leadership Initiative, I believe, and so forth. In other words, Goldman Sachs is also talking about just transition. So careful. But when we hear when we hear these words, just transition means a working class, people-centered transition of polluting industries in ways that give a soft landing to the people involved in them, and saying, okay, well, we are going to do a federal jobs program for people in coal country that involves, remediating all the damage based on coal, and also doing endogenous development. I think there's a recent book, which I only had a chance to skim, from West Virginia University Press. Actually, they have a very valuable and intelligent editor who is on, you can follow him on Twitter. They have a book about Appalachia, like Green Socialism Appalachia, something like that. I'm mangling the title. And, he's talking about what, not that I'm talking about is not Mazen Laban, although he writes for them also. But no, it's from a lawyer, and he's working on a just transition based on endogenous development from Appalachia. And in fact, they have been talking about endogenous Green New Deals based on in situ development using their local resources, eco-development, you can say. They've been talking about that for 15 years, right? And one can actually find articles about it. They have been talking about their own Green New Deal in Appalachia, right? So there are proposals. The problem is that those proposals are not audible, and they're not audible. Yes, Nicholas Stump, thank you. Those proposals are not audible precisely because they do not serve the interests of the people exporting coal, and they do not serve the interests of the people exporting oil, the oil companies, right? So we need to think, okay, we have to really, be beyond conscientious when we think about these things, right? We have to say, okay, like there are proposals. Now, there aren't enough proposals, to be sure. I want to be clear about that, right? But there are proposals, and in our thinking about these things, and in someone's political practice, God willing soon, someone has to knit these proposals together for just transitions locally and nationally. And at least at the theoretical or planning level, this is what I thought I was trying to do a little bit. It's a small contribution, because other people really not other people are doing it. Many other people need to be doing it on a wide scale in order to even for us to begin to grasp the depth and breadth of the problem and be able to think in terms of resolving it based on a worldwide just transition, right? Now, this is how we sidestep the fact that we have coal company or coal country, same thing in this case, senators and Congress people who are claiming to represent the interests of working people and are also working in the interests of the coal companies, precisely because there's an element of truth to that, right? The same way the most right-wing Democratic senators are also representing somehow the interests of their constituencies. If they were just cynical liars, this would be very easy, right? But there's an element of truth to that precisely because there is not a constituted political alternative that's making a different idea and mode of reforming and reshaping the internal political and social texture that's making it reasonable, rational, and also pragmatic and possible, right? That alternative doesn't really exist. Even if people sometimes certain false alternatives, I think, are often inflated or varnished and presented as existing in a substantive way, right? And I think this is important to keep in mind. The collusion with unions is another good example. I mean, unions, we can't take an economistic perspective on unions, right? Unions, this isn't about, we don't need to go all Lenin about trade union consciousness, but we do need to be talking about the fact that unions, for example, the AFL-CIO, are often supporting coups in Latin America. I am against coups in Latin America. I don't think, there are some coups in the Arab region I've supported, but like in Latin America, I don't believe it's a good idea for the U.S. business unions to go in and support the overthrow of democratically elected populist governments. Like, I don't like that. So I'm not just in favor of something because a union does it, and I think that is why we need a reformation of the domestic union movement on internationalist grounds. How is that possible? So to get to the last portion of the question, if I really knew how any of these things were possible, I would be doing it. You would be like, I would be, my last name would be like Cabral or Lenin or something, but it's not, so I don't have any, I always tell people that because I often get asked that and I'm like, no, this is not what I know how to do. Someone needs to know how to do that soon, but I have no idea.
Thank you. We're glad that you have the last name that you have. Okay, Ricardo Jacobs, please.
Yeah, thank you, Max. This was very great. I have lost connection, so I might ask questions that might have been asked already. So the first question that I have is how you think, and it might have been asked about, the power relations necessary that has to change to implement this program, because nothing is given. The second question I have is when you think about the rare deal that indigenous populations have developed in 2019, and how do you see the interconnection between those and your formulation of the national question and national sovereignty? If you think about, particularly in the US case, how do you think about those three elements interact with each other, particularly your conception of the People's New Green Deal and the rare deal that the indigenous population in the US also have formulated, and what would be necessary if we can shift power, because it's a question of power relations, it's not just a question of new perspective. And so I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Right. I think I betrayed my inability to answer the first part of your question in my last response, but I'll say just a tiny bit about it, which is that I think, there remains a crisis of willingness to be, to think about, what we can say using many words, the kind of autonomous thinking about liberatory horizons, right? People say, okay, that's a nice idea, but we have these people over here who are poorly representing a set of interests, and that's a pragmatic response, right? And especially, say, left-wing Democratic Congress people and senators, right? This is often the response, at least in the United States political sphere, right? I think that this idea that those people can deliver, it's not a question of considering them antagonists or not. Like that's a perpendicular question in a sense. But what first needs to be decided is what is the world we want to see, and how can we get organized locally, and what can we do locally that moves us forward to that world, and how can we interact with people who do get elected to positions of power while maintaining our values and our own independent formulation of a strategy to achieve the horizon that we've determined is the appropriate horizon, right? Don't let the horizon be determined by whoever can get elected at any given moment. That's how no one achieves change anywhere ever, right? The horizon has to be determined by reflecting the interests as a reflection or a crystallization of the interests of oppressed people north and south, right? That has to be the horizon. And then you engage in the political sphere in a strategic way to reach that horizon while maintaining the autonomy of one's own political organizations, right? This is the main crisis, in my opinion, in the US left at this moment, right? I mean, I think that plays out in a great variety of ways. You know, there's actually other people who can speak to that far better, many people. But that seems to me the primary crisis. I mean, how to apply that principle, which I strongly support locally, you know, I don't know, but I think you know, promoting or kind of falling in behind certain leadership and saying, okay, well, you know, don't criticize them. You know, this habit of both mind and political subjectivity and political agency, I think this really needs to be criticized very sharply, because I don't find it productive, right? I mean, you know, most blatantly, I've seen it in the case where, you know, Ocasio-Cortez does something that harms the Palestinian cause, and people are like, do we really need to criticize her? And it's like, yeah, we can criticize her. She'll be okay. Like, she's always going to be okay if you criticize her. And, you know, I think this is where you really see the surrender to pragmatism. And this is kind of what got a lot of, this is what causes the crisis, right? In terms of the interaction, I mean, between political sovereignty, I mean, the political sovereignty I was talking about was in the South, right? Not in the North. You know, the Northern political sovereignty is not something I really defend at all. Now, you know, I think this is important, though, to go back to the foundational texts about national liberation. Right? National liberation was not the same thing ever, first of all, as self-determination. Right? National liberation was, first of all, conceived as a way of against monopoly capital. Right? I mean, that was national liberation. It was also about expanding you know, poor people's access to land, and it was conceived as enfolding also economic decolonization, including popular control over the economy. Right now, in the current moment, the reason you know, there's a lot of I do get a lot of pushback in these spaces the way I talk about political sovereignty, and you know, I think that we need to come to terms with the fact that a lot of progressives in the United States do not think of political sovereignty in the South as something that is inviolable. There's a lot of perception that it can be contingently violated, right? I mean, for me, it's not a question of liking or disliking the internal political or economic or social texture of a lot of states in the South. Of course I don't. But I don't think that the violation of the juridical container and territorial container of the nation state, whether through warfare or unilateral coercive measures, is going to achieve an outcome. I don't think that there's any right to apply those measures. And I don't think they can achieve any just outcome for working people. That's my, you know, that's the position. I think that's very different from supporting the national liberation or decolonization struggles in places like the United States or Canada, where of course I think that supporting those struggles will achieve a good outcome. For example, even at a minimum, the defense of treaty rights or the defense of unceded land claims in Canada, right? I think it's clear to me that leads to enhanced prospects for freedom and justice on behalf of those making the claims for you know, treaty rights or making claims about unceded land. And I think it's very distinct from this question of accepting the kind of surrender of or the breaking of Southern political sovereignty.
Thank you, Max. So the next two questions come from Jan Peters and Charmaine Chua. Jan, you're muted.
Max, thanks for such a great overview. It's always important to see that of course, there is the power of the incumbents, as several people have already pointed out. For instance, the WTO is in a state of impasse already since, I think, since the 1990s, precisely on the point of agriculture. So the power of incumbents is tremendous, and while it is important to plea for a just transition and a worldwide convergence, I think that the balance of the discussion of forward proposals should point towards a balance in which the incumbents are given a stake in some of the transformations. And the key hinge here is climate change and sustainability. So if that is brought to the foreground, so that we frame the discussion in the sense of Gramsci's hegemonic battle, in which also the other sides have an interest in the transformation, and that is highlighted, so you get a new distribution of interest, and you stand a chance of breaking the impasse. For those who have experience in future studies, like Marcus has, also myself, this is a key point. A new articulation and distribution and combination of interest. Thanks, Max.
Should I go, Vladimir? Cool. Thanks, Max, so much for this wonderful talk. Your work has always been, wonderfully synthetic in a way that I've learned so much from. So really appreciate this. I have two questions that I feel like are very long answers, but answer in whatever time you have. The first is, if I just wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more about your position on degrowth. Some critiques, of course, are assumptions that it's anti-modern in its imagination. So if you could say a bit more about how you think about it in the context of the People's Green New Deal. And the second is, I think, something that you touched on here and there, but I'd like to hear more elaboration on, which is, how do we understand in the North our responsibility to a substantively internationalist project within the complicated ways that there's often contestation within the South against Southern elites on the terrain of sort of contesting different kinds of projects. Because I think part of what happens in the North, in the Northern left, is sometimes a kind of tanky approach in which, in order to build an internationalism, we then have to align ourselves with Southern leaders who have then been criticized by their own populations for different kinds of approaches. And I think within this, there's also, I think, complicated questions of, for example, in the Venezuelan Chavismo project, the ways that energy and extraction have been critical to that vision of socialism. So what does it mean to reject fossil fuel accumulation in terms of sort of reckoning with how different kinds of socialist projects have actually seen it as central to different kinds of visions of economic decolonization? Thanks.
Great, thank you. Quickly, John, I think part of the problem of finding a kind of new community of interests with the incumbents is that I myself have a different politics, but even from a pragmatic perspective, the incumbents are practically paralyzed in terms of inability to actually work beyond any short-term monetary measures, right? I mean, this is just and I think the Lazanek on the shifts in capitalism ever shorter term planning horizons and so forth, has showed the kind of the underlying political economy of that. So I just like, you know, and I'm actually working on a critique right now of the Human Development Report of 2020. And, you know, this, it hasn't worked, right? From pragmatic perspective, right? It hasn't worked. So that's my response is like, you know, even from a pragmatic perspective, it doesn't make sense to me to try this approach, which doesn't seem to me have been particularly productive. Now, thank you so much, Charmaine, for these difficult questions, to say the least. But I you know, degrowth is a very, very broad, multi-denominational church, right? And so there are a lot of, in fact, it's a multi-religious church, right? So, you know, you're talking about a lot of different people. And I'm always super supportive of degrowthers in general, because I feel like they're doing a lot of good work to challenge the screwed up world. But I have kind of two interlocking sets of critiques. I mean, or one, you know, a lot of people will say, okay, you know, if you take take the people, you know, I remember this point from Arrighi is that we should challenge an argument on its best point rather than its worst. So take the degrowthers who are the most acute and astute about criticizing global capitalism, right? Now, the question is this an effective message to speak in terms of degrowth? Now, I don't know. Maybe it is and maybe it isn't. You know, if you tell me, oh, well, it can be attacked in the public sphere, anytime you try and do something transgressive, it's going to be attacked in the public sphere. You can talk about increasing taxes on the rich by $1 on a million, and you're going to get attacked in the public sphere. So everything you're going to get attacked in the public sphere, right? So this does not seem to me a serious critique. For myself, what I have found more effective in communication, but this from a very narrow experience, frankly, is I say, these are the sectors I want to see grow, and these are the sectors I want to see shrink, period. While moving towards overall social decommodification, saying I want to see just transitions for polluting sectors, and I want to, and their gradual controlled shrinkage towards elimination or as fast as possible, depending on how polluting they are. I want to see massive increases in renewable infrastructure and agroecology and mass transport and preventative health and so forth. Now, if the degrowth people is actually, they've gotten a huge amount of attention, so maybe they're doing better communication than me. I don't know, you know? So I don't have an answer to that specific aspect. I think, you know, if you find really vociferous degrowth critics, some of whom I refuse to even name them, but dignify them because I think they're poor negative actors. But they will also say it's fundamentally a communication problem. Okay, so who's right? I don't know, you know? I don't know about that. In terms of it being anti-modern, you know, I think of modernity as being about complicated, socially interdependent life with some form of high industrial technology linked with it. I mean, so I don't think any degrowthers are really against that. I think often that's attributed to them, but I don't really think very many of them embrace it, although maybe they should do a better job of emphasizing that they're, of course, in favor of the controlled, modulated industrialization. I don't see, it's boggling to me that they wouldn't be. I mean, it seems to me that the degrowthers have always been weakest. You know, I saw there's an article, and again, them I don't want to pick on because I don't want to be cruel, but like there's an article saying that contemporary US imperialism is about global market relations. And I was like, that's what's going on in Iraq and Yemen? You know, I was like, you guys need to figure out better about what's going on, because what's going on in Yemen is not about global market relations. I mean, what, we want access to the cot market or Yemeni coffee? It's not a very realistic assessment. So they need to do better on their, what we call global political economy, right? In my humble opinion, right? Over that, I would say is a fair critique as an overall thrust. But you know, in terms of the constitution of a substantive international project, I mean, I think there's a lot going on, both with a question and any possible answer to it. I mean, I think first of all, there's a question of location, right? Where we are all inserted. I mean, I myself don't live most of the time in the United States, for one, myself, but you know, I think that there have to be priorities, first of all, right? I mean, there's priorities in the struggle. Like, I don't think we can, I don't believe in denying the existence of internal contradictions or, you know, to use a certain rhetoric, secondary contradictions in any given moment. I think to deny them is politically and intellectually dishonest, of course. But we have to decide strategically what's and analytically what's primary or secondary at a given moment, right? I think. I mean, I think that there are surely very many internal contradictions in the what's going on in Yemen and the forces resisting the Saudis and the US, right? Which I don't know about, but I'm very sure there are. And I know, in fact, some of the people working on food sovereignty, what looks like food sovereignty. I mean, I'm taking an easy case to make the point. I know it's not the case you brought up, but it's just to make I'm not trying to be evasive. I'm just trying to use it to clarify the point from my perspective. And so, but I think it's clear that those aren't it's not like, you know, one should learn about those contradictions if one is interested in Yemen and in any future internationalist project of a certain type. There could be places for discussing those contradictions, right? But does that mean we should be discussing them openly in the same way as the war? I don't think so, right? And so I think, you know, I think our contemporary political subjectivity and messaging can be distorted by the way the internet has collapsed everything into kind of one horizontal mass, right? Where public, private, social media, everything, you know, scholarly work, publicly facing work, it all can it's all just like pixels in front of us, right? And this is not a critique as much as like self-reflection, is that like it can be very hard. It promotes, I think, the flattening of contradiction, I think, naturally. I mean, I think it's actually like a nature of the medium itself that we can lose track. And there's different spaces for different contradiction, different conversations always. And so, as I said, like, I'm never in favor of denying the contradiction. If someone asks me directly, I would, and if anyone says, like, you know, these contradictions don't exist, I'm like, well, that's silly. Like, of course they do, right? As they exist in Venezuela, right? But, you know, to get to Venezuela, which is a case I really do know well, right? I've been going to Venezuela for 16 years. You know, and again, it's easiest for me to speak personally about this, right? I think that people would associate me with this position of tanky or campy or whatever, even though I would be promoting the people, the grassroots movements all the time, you know? And I'll share that all the time, right? And share grassroots stuff all the time, because I think it's amazing what's happening at the grassroots. So, you know, I think sometimes, you know, I worry that, I worry that, you know, okay, well, look at what people are doing and saying, right? And are people, in fact, always doing, I'm not saying you're doing this, but sometimes other people are doing this to me and are saying that, like, you're just flattening out all the internal contradictions. I'm like, no, I'm not. Like, I'm just not. It's just not the case. Like, and, you know, what do you do with that, right? And so this is part of the problem. But insofar as, you know, insofar as people do that, then there's a space for criticism and saying, okay, well, then there is a space, there are grassroots movements with a complicated relationship with the state, and no one is served. And I say the ones with complicated, and I say that they have a complicated position, like Reinaldo Turiza and so forth, and you know, 23 de Enero and the Barrio movements, and Angel Prado and so forth. They have complicated relationships with the state, for sure, while they prefer that some aspect of Chavismo maintains state power, right? That's, and as far as I know, not being an expert, although following it as well as I can while doing a few other things, to say the least. But so, you know, that's kind of as much as I can provide of an answer, because I don't think there's a, that's an answer from my experience as trying to push a certain political perspective that I think is justified. And this is my experience of trying to navigate some of these contradictions on these questions specifically. I mean, and I just want to get to this question of energy. I mean, you know, the energy problem is brutal. I mean, in terms of the extraction, the question of extraction. But I mean, and there are, you know, the Arco Minera in Venezuela is being sharply criticized, I know, by some movements there. And in Bolivia and Ecuador, I think it's historically more complicated. But, you know, again, I think there is a, you know, I don't agree with this theory of extractivismo. Like, I don't think this is actually been a lens that's brought the social world or the political ecology of the world system into the appropriate focus, right? You know, I think that all extraction is polluter. I mean, that's the biophysical nature of extraction. It's going to pollute the environment. There's basically isn't another way to do it. Could be more polluting or less polluting. The less polluting it is usually the more expensive modes of extraction that are available. So if you want, now, you know, for this, I prefer that I, at least personally, have learned a lot from the debates from starting in UNCTAD, UN Conference on Trade and Development, to reaching onto the new economic order and debates about uneven exchange, environmentally uneven exchange, in that there's a problem, again, of northern underpayment for southern resources. You know, if I want Bolivia to extract half as less resources, sure. But why don't we pay them twice as much for their resources, right? I mean, this isn't meant to be a reductio ad absurdum, but this is saying that, okay, there is a problem of underpayment for these resources, right? And in the interim, what are these countries supposed to do to develop, right? I mean, you cannot find more of a supporter for an agriculturally based plan for development using agroecological development technologies, but you know, that takes a lot of time, and in the meantime, people need access to a lot of things that are mediated through the world market that you need capital for. So where are they going to get it, right? This doesn't, you know, and how are you? So it seems to me that the more complicated question is, how are state projects, because it's currently states who are superintending these processes of extraction. It could be something different in the future, but for now it's states. How are they managing these internal contradictions that arise from inevitably socio-ecologically harmful processes of extraction? While how are they managing it? Well, there's a lot of answers to that, right? And are they managing in such a way that people get really pissed off at them? I hope not, you know, because to the extent they do, then they open themselves up to destabilization, which makes life worse for everybody, including the people raising the legitimate complaints to begin with. Again, it's not, I don't know if it's a direct answer, but it's the only answer I have to the question.
Thank you so much, Max. We have reached the end of our allotted time, I'm afraid. So thank you for sharing your expertise with us. Every research topic is important, but here in your case, we're literally talking about the future of our planet, of our survival. So thank you for moving the conversation forward with your book. And everyone, please join me in thanking Max for being here. We also know that you just arrived in Tunisia and it's quite late there right now. So we appreciate your being here and making the time.
My pleasure. Thank you for these wonderful moderating and all the questions. Actually,
Brilliant talk. Thank you, Max.
So thank you so much. Bye
Before everyone
bye.
leaves, next week we'll be hosting Alex DeWall, who will be talking about crisis in the Horn of Africa. So hope to see you all there. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you,
See you,
everyone.
Max.
Thanks, Max.
Thanks, Max.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye bye. Au revoir.